Hi folks, this is Tim Garman for SIT on NZDP 101, and this will be the first part of an introduction to Adobe Camera Raw. Now you should have Adobe Camera Raw as part of your Photoshop software, and it's built in so it creates quite a nice workflow remaining in the one program. Now photographers these days prefer to shoot in RAW format, and the reason for that is that the RAW format captures a wider dynamic range, which means basically you're capturing more data, and of course the more data that you capture, the more control it gives you over your images, and that's over and above the standard JPEG format. So I would recommend shooting in RAW. It will create larger files, but obviously there's more data there which we can use. Now, looking at the screen, we've got Photoshop open at the moment, and we then want to open an image. So there's a number of ways we can open an image. I can just shoot off the screen and drag an image in and drop it into the frame. And here we've got the calibration image that I'm going to use just to demonstrate a few things. While we've got this image open, I should point out, as I did in the introduction to Photoshop, my previous video, that we should be able to see to the left a difference between 0% and 5% at the larger end of that grayscale chart, and at the other end a difference between 95% and 100. Now it's only going to be very subtle, but if you can see that difference, then we're going to be looking at pretty much the same thing. Also, just looking at the skin tones here on this lady on the right, that those skin tones look reasonably natural. Now I know that people from different parts of the world have different skin tones and colours, but as long as that doesn't look too odd or odd at all, then we know that we're looking at the right sort of thing. The other thing to say is when we talk about calibrating our screen, just to make sure that you're not sitting in any very strong light that's shining on your screen, because that's going to start to destroy your image as you look at it. Because you want to be able to make some judgments on the images that you look at in terms of color and exposure. So also, if you're on a laptop, let's make sure that the screen is not tilted, that it's upright, and that you're looking at it in that upright position each time, because that tilt on the screen will affect how the colours look. Now let's just close this down, because there are a couple of other ways we can open up an image. One is the very obvious way of going to File and Open and then browsing for our image. But I'm going to open this as a smart object. So I'm going to choose Open as a Smart Object from the File menu in Photoshop. Just browse for my image and click Open. And that's pretty large on the screen, so I might just use the keyboard shortcut Command minus on a Mac, which would be Control minus on a PC, just to bring that down a bit. You can go up and down with the plus and minus keys that way. So what has this done? This has opened this as a smart object. So a smart object is embedding the raw image into the Photoshop document. And that's going to just start us on the path to non-destructive editing, because we want the ability to hop between Photoshop and Camera Raw so that we can make our edits in Camera Raw, see them appear in Photoshop, but then hop back into Camera Raw and re-edit or adjust if we need to. And so nothing is destroyed, nothing is set in stone. It's completely flexible in the way that we edit our images. Let's go ahead and open this in Adobe Camera Raw. So I'm going to go up to the Filter menu and select Camera Raw Filter. You'll notice you get the keyboard shortcuts there, and that's displaying the Mac keyboard shortcuts. Shift Command A on a PC. Shift Control A. So if we select that, we get the image in Adobe Camera Raw, and you see the Camera Raw screen sits over the top of the Photoshop window. So there we see the same image. I can use the same keyboard shortcuts to reduce that down. So on a Mac, Command minus, and just while we're on the magnification, over on the right you'll see we have some tools, and I've got the magnifying glass tool, or the zoom tool I should call it rather than describing it. The zoom tool selected at the moment, and if I click and drag, that does the same thing as plus and minus. It enlarges or reduces. We can also use the space bar. If I hold the space bar down, I get the hand tool, which enables me to navigate around the screen in that way. And you'll notice what's happening over here when I hit the space bar over on the right. It is toggling between the two. Now, if you want to permanently select the hand tool, we can select H on the keyboard, and you see now we have the hand tool permanently selected. So let's have a look at the top right and some of the controls we have in Adobe Camera Raw. So here we've got the histogram, and there's some information on the histogram in the week 1 study guide. But at the top we have the shadow clipping warning, that's on the left, and the highlight clipping warning on the right. And the histogram is showing all the image data and the color and shade of pixels. Now, if we wanted to look at the shadow clipping areas on this image that we're looking at, this is now indicating areas that are solid black. So if we had an image that we've taken and we've got some areas that are solid black, that means really that we're likely to be losing detail in those black areas. They would be pretty much lost in the darkest areas of our image. So this is a good way of finding out the areas of the image that have lost detail. And if we go to the other extreme, in red, it's showing us the areas that are completely burnt out. Now obviously on this page we've got some white areas, so that's there's no detail there, so it's indicating those areas. So areas on our images that have got bright highlights, we still want some detail in there. Now our eye tends to get drawn to the lightest, brightest areas in an image. So we want to make sure that if people are looking at those areas on our images, that there's something to look at. So there's still some detail in those bright areas. So that's a good way of just seeing what needs to be adjusted to bring those areas back. So we can switch those indicators off. Now obviously black and white photographs will perhaps have a little less detail in the highlighted areas and the dark areas, and also that will rather depend on what kind of adjustments you're making to the image as well. Now looking down, let me just close that to begin with. We've got a series of tabs here, starting with the basic tab, but before we get there, we've got an auto button, which is basically going to give us some auto presets for adjustments on our image. So just allowing Photoshop to do the work for us. Now I wouldn't recommend that because we want to have control over this rather than letting the software do it for us. But we also have a black and white button which we can press, and straight away the image is converted to a black and white image. Now I'm going to undo that because we also, if we look at profile, we have a monochrome option which also converts our image to black and white. But here we can skip between the two. So let's start under the basic tab looking at the white balance adjustment. Now again, there's some presets here that we could use, but we can also set a custom white balance. So we get a useful little video clip as we mouse over these tools telling us roughly what it does, but we have an eyedropper here. Now what I'm going to do is just blow up the area of this image that has this wonderful person on it. because I've got the eyedroppers selected. And what I want to do to set the white balance is choose an area of either of a neutral grey or an area of white perhaps. Now if I choose that area, you'll perhaps see a slight adjustment, and we can see an adjustment has been made to the temperature and tint values. We could select perhaps a different area and see that change again. Well, what I will do is reset those sliders, and to reset the sliders, just double click on the arrow and they will go to the center 0 position. So that's gone back to where it was. But that's the use of the dropper tool to set a white balance. So looking at the temperature slider, and let's just reduce that back down again, we can drag that to one end and it goes more to a cooler or bluer color temperature, and at the other end we get a warmer effect. Double click to reset that. For the tint controls, one way is going towards the greens and the other way is going towards the mauves or purples. Let's look at exposure, and obviously we can increase or decrease to take the image darker, or overexpose if we want to at the other end. We've got controls over contrast, but be aware that perhaps using too much of this, and if we look again at the image of the woman, decreasing the contrast will obviously give the image a more sort of blown out look, and increasing it too much we'll start to see, particularly within the skin tones, and also these folds in the background will just become a little more defined and probably too defined. So let's just centralize that again. Controls over highlights and shadows, and white values and blacks. So we can play with these, and I would suggest you do exactly that. Play with them and see exactly what they do, because ultimately you're going to need to develop the ability to look at an image and know what it needs to be edited well, and that's only something that will come with time. We also have texture, clarity and dehaze, and particularly clarity I'll just focus on to begin with, and if we blow this image up on the screen, let's just have a look at what it does to the grayscales at the top. If I increase clarity up to its maximum, and let's just take that down to 0, we'll see that there's a greater contrast between the 40% and the 50%. Now you'll notice on the screen that this 40% area looks darker on one side than it is on the other, and the same with the 50%, and that is simply because it's placed next to a darker area. Now clarity is going to sharpen our images, but pushing it too far to the right will add some digital noise as well, which is less desirable. So perhaps bring it down to a bit further to the left. Texture is going to do pretty much what it says as a title, and add some texture into that area. And if I blow it up again, perhaps we can start to see some of that appearing. Now if I hold my mouse over the dehaze title, that pretty much tells us what the dehaze tool does. So if we have an image that has some haze in it, we can adjust that or reduce it by moving to the right, but going the other way will actually add a haze effect. Coming on to vibrance, let's take this image down in size, and increasing the vibrance right up to the right, you'll see intensifies the colors, and in fact if we take saturation up as well, you see those colors are way beyond what we would want to use for a natural looking image. Just centralize those. Taking saturation right back the other way gives us a black and white image. if we did the same with vibrance, well, it loses a lot of the colour, but not all of it. So there are better ways of creating a black and white image than taking saturation down, but that's the effect that it has. The next palette down is the curve. So let's have a look at this. And as we open this tab up, we see that our image is defined or described in this curve, and it doesn't look much like a curve at the moment, but we can adjust that to adjust various exposures and color values in our image. So first of all, at the top where we have adjust, the first one on the left is the parametric curve. Now we have two options, the parametric curve, or if I move to the next one along, you'll see it says the point curve. And they both work in similar ways. To start with, we'll look at the parametric curve. And we see that we have some sliders and we have some range adjustments beneath the curve. So the important thing to note here is that if we look up and down the curve, at the bottom we see over on the right bottom corner, it tells us that that area is the shadows. Then we move into darks, lights, highlights, and we have controls for those areas at the bottom. So if we move the highlights slider, we see that the image, our test image or test screen image on the left is being adjusted, and at the same time you'll see that this is looking more like a curve now, because that top area, which is the highlight area of our calibration screen image, is adjusted. Now once we have a value in there, we can then apply these range values to fine-tune that part of the curve, and you'll see that that is adjusting the curve. So we can do that for each of those sliders. So if we double click to reset that to the middle, which incidentally we can do with these range settings as well, if we adjust the shadows to make the image darker, or the darkest areas in the image darker, you'll see that that's indicated on the curve, and we can further adjust that should we want to. And it's also worth saying, just with all of these palettes, that there's an eye icon in the top right corner, which we can click and hold the mouse button to see the before and after effect. So let's then have a look at the point curve. So we go to the next one along, and it's also worth saying that whilst we're on the parametric curve, we've got a parametric curve targeted adjustment tool. Now I'll come to those in a minute, but that changes to the point version of that tool as we move along the line. So here we're on the point curve now, and this is similar to the parametric curve, except that we can actually add points to our curve, and we can then customize exactly how our curve looks. So it becomes a much more accurate way of working. Now, if you're not looking for such an accurate approach to the image that you're editing, then perhaps the parametric one is the one to go for. So we can add up to, I think, 16 points on this curve. If we want to remove a point, we can just drag it away, or we could double click it and they disappear as well. It's also worth pointing out that we have some custom settings. So if we chose a medium contrast, it adds the points for us, and our image is affected accordingly. And of course we could adjust each of those points to get even further fine-tuning if we needed to. Then we can move along and do the same thing for colours. So with the reds, we can add some points and start to add more red into our image, or less red and more green, and that works for each of those colours. So let's just go back to the parametric curve and choose the targeted adjustment tool. And if we click in an area of our image and hold our mouse down, you see we get a gradient from the shadows on the left to the highlights on the right, which we can move from left to right to adjust. And that is affecting the whole of our image, but targeting that particular value where we've clicked. And we can further edit it on the curve if we wanted to. So let's just set those back to where they were, and then go to the point adjustment tool. And so we've got the targeted, or the point curve targeted adjustment tool, and this works in a similar way. We hold the mouse down and we get that adjustment, and you can see the point adjusting on the curve as we move.